guys, how's it going? And welcome to the Rebel Pastor YouTube channel. Pastor Sky over here, and I am not in South Korea. Where am I right now at this time? I am in North Korea. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not in North Korea. I may never escape. No, I'm actually here in Vancouver, Canada. I'm here visiting my parents for the next couple of weeks. So I'm very, very much enjoying my time. Just want to let you guys know it is day 3. Right? So the time, the jet lag is like 15, 16 hours away. So I am not fully in my right mind. And if you see the bags under my eyes, that's because I am exhausted, right? So we're going to continue in with the series for Hard Questions for Christians. And great question I got last week. And the question is, why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? Right? Isn't that kind of twisted? And when you really think about it, it's like, yeah, isn't that a twisted request that God is asking someone to sacrifice their son to prove their faith? Like, why would God request such a thing? So we're going to get right into the answer for this question. I think it's very, very important because, yeah, to us right now, it is very, very twisted for this loving God to request something like this to one of his followers, right? So the first thing I want to tell you guys is this. Just to kind of set a standard or a baseline is, in order for us to understand the Bible really well, one of the videos I made in the past was the Bible was not written to you, it was written for you, right? So the Bible was written to a specific audience in a specific time, in a specific place, with a specific culture and language, right? It was written to them. However, it is written for all mankind. Why? Through the experiences that people have with God and through the teachings God gave all throughout the Bible, we're able to learn about God through their experiences, through the timeless words of God. So when you look at the Bible, right, you have to understand, like, this is one of the things that I want to kind of prep your hearts and your mind for first, okay? And what does that mean? It basically means that when you look at the Bible, from the very beginning until now, when you read the entire Bible, was all knowledge and all truth given since the beginning? And the answer is absolutely not. Knowledge and information that God gave to human beings was given over a period of time, right? So let me give you a great example for this. When it comes to like laws and rules, in the very beginning, there was Adam and Eve, and how many rules did they get? And the answer is 1, do not eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? That was it. There was no other rules besides this. And then you go over 2,500 years later, it was a time of Moses, and Moses received the 10 Commandments. And of course, there were other laws, 613 altogether, including the 10 Commandments. But still, it's like, wait a second. There's one law from Adam and Eve, and then over 2,500 years later, it's going to be like, 600 laws. And then by the time it gets to Jesus, which is 4,000 years after Adam and Eve, Jesus basically brought the rules of the heart. Like, murder is not just murder, it's hating your brother. Adultery is not just committing adultery on your husband or wife, it is actually lusting after another person, which means the rules kept changing and they kept upgrading over time. God kept giving more rules, more laws, more truth as time went on. And the thing that we have to learn from this is God doesn't give us everything right away. God gives to us according to how ready we are, right? And I do believe that we should think about that too, right? Like, think about in our lives, human beings also think the exact same way, right? Just as God doesn't give everything right away to us, right? He only gives to us what we can handle. We do the same thing with the people in this world, right? For instance, what about parents, when do you talk to your children about the birds and the bees, right? About sexual education? You have to wait till they're ready for it. When you tell a child that they're adopted, you have to wait till they're ready for it, right? And this is something that even human beings do, that we don't give all the information. Sometimes we know that children shouldn't hear certain things. And because of that, we will wait for them to be more mature and ready, and then we give them more information. And in the same way, too, we have to understand that God treated human beings in the same way. It was according to time and their level. And this is something that is quite normal for everyone. All right. So now that you understand this, let's get into the first thing that I want you guys to think about when we get into this question of why would God ask Abraham to do something so twisted, to sacrifice his only son, right? And the first question I want to give to you is, why such a huge sacrifice? Like, why this sacrifice? And the first question that would come to my mind is like, wait, is this a common thing? Was God asking everyone to sacrifice their children? And the answer is no. It was not a common request by God to people in the Bible, and it was only done twice, right? It was only done twice, right? So the thing you have to understand is, this is quite interesting because it's not a common thing. It's not something that God has always been asking every person, but it was only done twice. We're going to get into both of these first. And the first one obviously being Abraham sacrificing his own son, right? So it is not a common request. So the bigger question we need to ask now is well, why did he ask Abraham to do it like this? Why, And the one thing that we should understand is God, if there's something great that must be done, it requires a greater condition, right? It's almost like tests. When you go to school, there's a test. There's going to be like quizzes, there's tests, there's midterms, and there's finals. And each of them have, they're bigger and bigger because there's a bigger outcome for what it is, right? Usually the bigger something is, the more it costs. So what was so big at the time of Abraham that it cost his son, right? Now, let's take a look at who Abraham is. Abraham is coined as the father of faith, right? So what does it mean, the father of faith? The father of faith is not just saying that, he is someone with great faith. He was actually the beginning of faith, right? Being the father of faith, that faith started from him. Now, what does that mean? And how am I going to prove this? Well, look at the time of Adam and Eve. Were they the beginning of faith? And they were technically supposed to be, but they failed. They committed the fall. And because of that, there was silence for 1,600 years. Okay? Now, after 1,600 years came Noah. Noah was fine. He did everything God asked, but there was a mistake done by his son Ham. And interestingly, another 400 years of silence. Now, why am I bringing up the time of silence? Is because whenever there's a mistake, whenever something happened, there is silence. God no longer speaks to the people after that great mistake that was made. So after Adam, 1,600 years of silence. After Noah, 400 years of silence. But only from Abraham was there continuous history where God was constantly working through the people of Israel, person after person after person. From the time of Abraham, there was no silence. Now, how can I prove that, that at this time, this is where faith actually began? Well, look at exactly what Jesus said. If you look in Matthew chapter 22, verse 32, Jesus said, I'm not the God of the dead. I'm the God of the living. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Where did Jesus start from? He said, when Jesus says, I'm the God of the living, he didn't start with Adam and Eve. He didn't start with Noah. He started with Abraham. God considered the beginning from Abraham, not from Adam or Noah, which means that Abraham, what was so big that he needed to sacrifice his only son? The big thing was, it was the beginning of the history of faith. It was like the true beginning of the Old Testament time, which was 2,000 years after Adam and Eve. Abraham was the first to set the condition to start the history of God properly, where Adam and Noah could not. He was the actual beginning of faith, and the beginning required absolute faith in God. So what does that mean, right? What God requires from all of us is that God becomes the number one priority, right? Which back in those days, the number one thing that mattered more to everyone than anything else was the firstborn son. And sacrificing your firstborn son was the ultimate sacrifice to put God first, and it was required to start the history of God, or the actual beginning of the Old Testament faith. It was a huge beginning, and it required something big to start something that great, which is the history of God. Now, what was the only other time when a sacrifice of a son was actually needed? And interestingly, it was for the exact same reason, right? Remember, if you want something big to happen, it requires a bigger sacrifice. So when was the only other time in history that the sacrifice of a son was required? It was the time of Jesus, where God sacrificed his only son to save humankind. And that started the New Testament faith, right? So think about this. Old Testament faith, the beginning of a time period, the entire Old Testament began with Abraham, and that required the sacrifice of a son. And also in the same way, 2,000 years later, to start the New Testament history, exactly this, it was foreshadowing what was required to start a new time period. The New Testament started with the sacrificing of a son. Why? It's something that big to God. Now, the big question we're going to ask now is it twisted? Right? Is it really that twisted? Like now we know how big it was, why such a big sacrifice was required. But the real question comes in now is like, isn't that kind of twisted? And the answer is, it's like, yeah, it does seem like it. However, one of the things I do teach when I do Bible study is you have to look at things from the perspective of not the time you are living in. You have to look at it from the perspective of that time, right? Back then, who was the audience back then? And the times back then in the Old Testament, at the time of Abraham, is far different than it is today, right? Now, how different is it? Well, think about it. Human sacrifice was much more common back then compared to today. Let's take a look at a verse in Psalms chapter 106, verse 36 and 37. And it says, "They worshiped their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to false gods," which means that it was something that was actually happening back in those days. There was idol worship in the Old Testament times that did require child sacrifice. Some of them that we see that are in the Bible, like Molech. Molech required this. Baal required this. Kamosh required this. There was a lot of these idol worship, these idols that required human sacrifice, and it was being done back in those days. Even some of the kings in the Bible sacrificed their own children, like King Ahaz, King Manasseh. They sacrificed their own children to worship God or worship idols, right? It was much more common back then, as people thought that sacrificing the most important thing to them would appease their gods and in return curry favor in the most difficult times. Which means the question is it twisted? Today, it is so twisted, you're like, I can't believe God would do that. However, if you look back at those times, looking from their perspective, it was much more common with the idols they worshiped back then. It wasn't as twisted, it's still twisted, obviously, but it was something that was much more common back then. And if we look at from the lens of today's society and today's thoughts and knowledge, then it's something that you're just not going to understand God from. You're actually more going to misunderstand God, right? So that's something that we have to understand is, yeah, we kind of have to take ourselves out of the lens of today and look way back then and understand it's more common. And, the best examples would be just look at today. Like if you go from, we can travel a lot more. If you go from country to country, cultures are different, and what is acceptable in one country is not acceptable in another country, right? It's just the way it is. And just understanding even just cultural differences today will help us to understand is, yeah, for some people, things are more acceptable than others, no matter how twisted it seems, right? Now, one more thing I want to get into, I think this is really, really important too, is did God really want to sacrifice Isaac? And then, did God really want Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his only son? And the answer is no, obviously. How do we know? Because when it came down to Abraham right about to sacrifice his only son, what did God do? God stopped him. He didn't just stop him, he provided an animal to sacrifice instead of his only son, right? Which means it was never God's intention for Abraham to literally sacrifice his son. It was a test of faith. Is this person really someone who has faith in me, absolute, that he would do anything for me, putting me as number one, right? And that was a condition needed to begin the history of God. That's why he is the father of faith, right? So, this is something where we have to really understand in a very different way. And I hope it's something that we realize that if we don't understand the context and the background of what's happening in the Bible, or why certain things are happening, why it requires something so big, it makes the Bible very difficult to understand, and it'll make us think bad things about God. And what's going to happen is it's going to just make us misunderstand God too. But remember, the Bible wasn't written to you, it was written for you, right? And that's why we have to learn the Bible more. That's why we have to study the Bible more. And when we do this, we'll have a much better appreciation and understanding of God also. All right. So I hope that this question was answered for you guys. If you have any other questions, I would love just pop them below. Would love to hear these questions from you too. Right now, we are doing a series on hard questions for Christians, and I hope that it's something that helps you guys out in your walk of faith and answering questions when people are asking you like, oh, why is it like this? This is so twisted, or this doesn't make sense. And this is something that we can answer, and I hope it's something that will benefit you in your life of faith too. All right. There it is, guys. That is the end of today's podcast. Hope you guys have an amazing and awesome day. Yes, this is Pastor Sky signing out from Vancouver, Canada. Have an amazing and awesome day, and see you next week. All right, bye-bye.
Never settle, I raise the level. It's time to go, sky's the limit, it's me against the world.